On this episode of Skeptiko, Alex talks with Dr. Diane Powell about her potentially groundbreaking research into telepathy in autistic savant children.
So you're giving her a 6-digit number, a 2-digit number, and then you're saying, what is the answer if you multiply those two together? And then she's getting the answers telepathically.
Right, and how one of the reasons why I know that it is not that she's doing this because she's a mathematical savant is based on a couple of errors that the therapist made, because the therapist isn't someone who knows math, and so the therapist, when she looked at the piece of paper that had the equation that was asking for the cube root, and this happened on 2 occasions, 2 of the 10 equations were like this, where she's looking at it and she's mistaking the cube root symbol for meaning divide by 3. And so she asked, she asked the girl to, what's the first number? And then she gives this long number. And then she says, and what's it divided by? And the girl says 3. And then she says, and what's the answer? And the girl gives the answer for the cube root. She doesn't give the answer for dividing that number by 3.
Stay with us for Skeptiko.
Welcome to Skeptiko, where we explore controversial science with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Tsakiris, and on this episode, telepathy. Yes, we're going back to our old parapsychology roots here in Skeptiko because we have a rather extraordinary demonstration of telepathy. One that might actually knock one of the bricks out of that solid brick wall of materialism that we seem to be battling against. Our guest today is Dr. Diane Powell. You'll hear all about her fascinating research in this interview. I hope you enjoy it. Today we welcome Dr. Diane Powell back to Skeptiko. When we last heard from Dr. Powell in episode 197, I had to look that up, it was almost 1 year ago, the beginning of 2014. Well, this Johns Hopkins School of Medicine trained neuroscientist with postdoctorate training in psychiatry and a faculty appointment at Harvard Medical School. Yeah, folks, she's really, really smart, in case you don't remember that. Anyway, when we last talked to Diane, she was just getting ready to head off to India to conduct this really fascinating research into telepathy. And she was quite excited when we talked to her because she thought she really had a chance of nailing this down experimentally and showing people that this really can be demonstrated in a controlled experiment. So she's back to tell us what she found out. Dr. Powell, welcome to Skeptiko. Thanks again for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to talk about the research.
Oh, well, great. Let's jump right into talking about the research. Someone passed along a link to me about your work, and then you were nice enough to give me a peek at the paper that's about to come out. Go ahead, tell us what you did, why you did it, and then what you found out.
Well, what I did was years ago, I took my background as a neuroscientist and as a psychiatrist who spends time with patients and observing them and exploring what their experience of the world is. And I took that experience and I thought about who would be the most likely candidate to prove telepathy if telepathy is real. And I decided upon studying the population called autistic savants. And these are people with autism, but they're also people who have some special skill that's unexplainable. For example, a mathematical savant would be somebody who can do complex math, but they never had any formal training in how to do simple math, like simple multiplication. And so I thought that when I looked at some of these skills that were accepted by scientists as they're reliably reproduced and they're just as mysterious as some of them. Some of them are just as mysterious as what we would label as psi. So, for example, although you have people who, like Daniel Tammet, who can who can talk about, he can give you pi to over 22,000 decimal points. He's got a phenomenal memory, and he's also got phenomenal pattern recognition. And I thought I could explain the savant skills by that kind of a modeling. But when I was looking more and more at some of these savant skills, the people who were able to express what their experience is, their interior experiences, they'd said that they're not deriving it in their head, that the answer just pops into their consciousness, and they don't know how they get it. And so I thought, that just sounds so much like psi, maybe it is. And so I hypothesized that it's not necessarily that psi is a savant skill, it's more that if someone had psi, they may be labeled an autistic savant, and actually what they're doing is deriving the information psychically. And so I thought, I'm going to look for someone who's been diagnosed as an autistic savant, and then also for telepathy, I thought the situation which would make it most likely for someone to exhibit that would be if they had a high motivation. And so the highest motivation is to be trapped in a body in which you cannot verbally communicate. And that's the case for a child with nonverbal autism. We really don't have any reason to think that they don't have intact language capacity. What we do know is that they have an inability to control their ability to speak and their ability to move their body in a way that they can communicate in usual ways. So that's the population I targeted.
Wow. I mean, let me stop there and recap, because that's great thinking on your part. So you started out by saying, okay, here's a recognized anomaly, consciousness anomaly, if you will. They're underdeveloped in this one way, but they're super developed in this other way. And the key thing I heard you say is that this is accepted in science, in medicine. So we've studied savants, autistic savants. It's a known phenomena, so that's out of the way. And then you further said, I love this last part where you said, is this a population that we could expect to, one, experience psi, and you said because they're self-reporting that they are experiencing it, and it seems to line up with the way other folks experience psi. And then finally, I love this other angle that you put on it. You said, you just had this hunch as a psychiatrist, this group of people might be highly motivated to communicate. So those factors together is what led you in this direction. That's really quite amazing.
Yes. Well, thank you. And so what I have, and this is one of the reasons why I think I'm in a position where I could actually prove telepathy, is that I have a model. I mean, I'm approaching this as someone who studied, I've been in 5 different neuroscience laboratories. A lot of people don't realize that I spent 2 decades immersed in the very neuroscientific model that we get dismissed by as parapsychologists. So I'm really somebody who's bridging both worlds.
And you worked, just reading your Vita, it's just extremely impressive. You work with some very, very heavy people academically in terms of your neuroscience training. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. I've worked with people who have been Nobel laureates and Nobel candidates, and I worked in the neuroscience laboratory of Joseph Coyle, and and then I worked with him again when I did my child psychiatry training at Johns Hopkins. And so he knew me as both a neuroscientist and as a psychiatry resident, and he went on from Hopkins to be the head of psychiatry at Massachusetts General Hospital and McLean, where he still is. So I have people in academia who respect me as a scientist, and what I need to do is to translate this into the type of scientific language that I know they would understand.
Mm-hmm. Hey, and I'm sorry, Dan, I kind of shifted things a little bit, and I'm really curious about this, and you touched on it, and that's the model that you actually have. You have a theory and a model for how this might work.
Well, and one of the things that I'm doing is I have a testable model, and I really want to not get into my model too much because it's not published. So that part, I'd rather get into just explaining what I have in the way of data and where I want to go a little bit, and leave talking about the model until later, if you don't mind.
You bet. Go ahead.
So what I have in the way of data is I received a letter actually from the father of a child who was 9 years old at the time, and he had heard, because of my expressing my interest in this kind of child, he had heard that I was interested, and he had been referred to me by Daryl Trefford, who is an expert on autistic savants. And they thought initially that this girl was a mathematical savant because she was giving the answers to these very complicated math questions. For example, multiplying 6-digit by 6 digits, finding cube roots, 6-digit numbers, that sort of thing. And she couldn't do simple math. She couldn't do simple multiplication. And what happened was that when this therapist who works in the home with the girl, when she made a mistake, she found that the girl would copy her mistakes. And one time when she switched from using a calculator to generate the answer for these equations, because they're beyond what her ability to do, was the answer switched when she went from using a calculator to an iPad to a logarithmic expression, and the girl actually typed out the logarithmic answer, and that's what made the therapist go, whoa, what's happening here? And so it was someone in the field who's spending intense time with the patient, which is what I'm still a practicing psychiatrist, and it's spending time with people that you get to see that these things are real. But unfortunately, there's this huge divide between the people who are in the field doing this work and the people who are the neuroscientists who are in the position of creating basically the model for our understanding the brain and consciousness. And so there's oftentimes this big divide. It's one half isn't speaking to the other half.
So there's this therapist who's working with this child, and it's interesting. Let me make sure I got this right. You said she switched over from a digital calculator that gave the readout as a number, dot, and then a decimal. And then she switched over to an iPad and it gave the answer logarithmically. And as soon as she changed that, then the answers coming back from the kid she was working with changed accordingly. Is that, did I get that right?
Yes, exactly. So, for example, if the answer was what the number would be if you were using a different base, let's say you decided you were going to have the number, the answer expressed in a binary notation, just a series of ones and zeros, this girl would be able to express the answer in the ones and zeros to make it simple, because that's a binary expression of the same number.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. And then yet a second therapist independently who worked with the girl, because she has about 4 therapists who work with her. A second therapist independently had a similar experience where she made a mistake and the girl repeated her mistake, and then she saw this often enough that she said, hey, it's like you're reading my mind, and she just thought. She had the thought, how do you say I love you in German? And the girl typed out the German for I love you, ich liebe dich.
Oh my gosh.
So this created the opportunity to go and test her with 2 independent therapists. And the results, if people go to my website and they want to read the abstract, they'll see that the results are astounding. I mean, if there's this one period, I have over 4 hours of experimental footage with her. And there was a period of about 10 minutes in which she gave 162 out of 162 random numbers, and I was generating these with a random number generator. Out of 162, she only made 7 errors, and each one of those she corrected on the second try.
Say that again really slowly. So tell folks exactly the setup, and then how you conducted the experiment, and then what the results were.
So the setup was that the girl had been sitting, and when I was first contacted by her family, she would sit at the same table with the therapist, and the girl was typing independently the answers to these questions into either an iPad or into a talker, which is a device that has a QWERTY keyboard, and it has the numbers all there right on the device itself. It's something that it's been developed specifically for children with autism and special needs.
Right, because she's nonverbal again. She can't speak.
Right, so this is their communication device, correct. Right. And so she would just type into that using one finger. And so I said to them that they needed to have a visual barrier between the two of them because of the protocol that parapsychologists have to follow. There has to be no evidence of any kind of potential for visual or physical cueing. And so because the girl is autistic, and children who are autistic will react frequently in a way where they have tantrums when you introduce something new to their environment, because of that, you can only modify the environment in increments of change that they can handle. You want to minimize the stress to the person who's doing this, and so we introduced this. It's basically a standing mirror that's over 5 feet tall, and it's about 2 feet wide, and we put material over it so that the mirror part wasn't there, and that part was facing the therapist, but it had cloth over it. So it was essentially a 2-foot barrier between the two of them, and so that the therapist was on one side, and she would ask. This girl goes by the name of Haley, would ask Haley, what am I thinking, or what am I reading? And I had generated random numbers, I generated random sentences, I generated even fake words, and I gave them I had total control over the experimental conditions. It was only the therapist and Haley in the room on either side of this divider. And I was with my videographer in another room, and we had cameras documenting the experimental space entirely. We had cameras in front of them, behind them, mounted on either side of the divider, so that we saw everything. It's capable of a frame-by-frame analysis. And so we had a total of 5 different camera views watching everything. And the therapist would be given a stack of stimuli. For example, I think the most impressive time period was on the second day I was there, and I was only there for 3 days. It was the second day that I was there, and it was when I asked for her to give the numbers that are involved in mathematical questions. And so I generated these numbers using a random number generator, created these large equations with them. For example, maybe multiplying a 6-digit number by a 2-digit number, that sort of thing. And then I used a calculator to calculate the answer. And the reason why I set up this part of the experiment this way was that one of the things that I was told by the therapist, and this turned out to be true, was that she does better if she's fooled into thinking. She was getting bored with the constant telepathy experiments. They get bored. These are very bright children oftentimes. And so to make it more challenging for her, to make it feel like, okay, we're doing some homework here, I put it into this format of an equation.
Right.
And I wrote them down on pieces of paper after generating them, and then I put them in a stack, face down, handed them to the therapist, and she picked them up one by one, shows them to the camera on her side, and says to Haley, what number am I thinking? And Haley then would use her right hand to pick the number from a stencil, which these are they're plastic boards that are very thick that have cut out letters in them and numbers in them. And it's what she first learned language using. And we ended up having to work with her using her pointing to the stencil first, and then she'd type the answer with her left finger into the talker. We had to do it that way because that was the way that the therapists had been doing it with her leading up to the time that I was able to go there and film it. So we couldn't really change the protocol, so we just filmed it as accurately as we could.
So you're giving her a 6-digit number, a 2-digit number, and then you're saying, what is the answer if you multiply those two together? just to keep her mind occupied that there really is some mathematical work to be involved. And then she's getting the answers telepathically to each number, the two numbers you're multiplying together and the answer.
Right, and how one of the reasons why I know that it is not that she's doing this because she's a mathematical savant is based on a couple of errors that the therapist made, because the therapist isn't someone who knows math, and so the therapist, when she looked at the piece of paper that had the equation that was asking for the cube root, and this happened on 2 occasions, 2 of the 10 equations were like this, where she's looking at it and she's mistaking the cube root symbol for meaning divide by 3. And so she asked, she asked the girl to, what's the first number? And then she gives this long number. And then she says, and what's it divided by? And the girl says 3. And then she says, and what's the answer? And the girl gives the answer for the cube root. She doesn't give the answer for dividing that number by 3.
Wow, that's very interesting.
Yes. And so the experiments, I'm just describing a small set of the experiments, but I mixed it up. I had different ways in which I presented. I had different stimuli that I used. There's different ways in which I presented it. And so I have a lot of built-in controls in the data set itself. And this setup, no matter what people think is going on, this setup is a wonderful opportunity to explore this, whatever's going on here. Even if it were subtle cueing, which is really hard to imagine that it is, because you don't see anything that would indicate that.
Do we really have to go there? I mean, come on, this is such a simple experiment. You have 5 cameras, you have this divider.
Exactly.
I know you have to go there, but I almost think that's just like too goofy to even explore subtle cueing. I mean, we don't understand it. Yeah, but I mean, recap for me again. I don't want to, I know you have to go there, and I know you will in your paper, but give us again the results. So now we understand that. You got the 6-digit number, a cube root. I mean, which is a cube root. I mean, I can't do the cube root of 27. So a 6-digit number cube root. I don't even know. So then the results she gets, 100% of the numbers, like 30, 40 times in a row.
And what was fascinating, she did that all in 10 minutes. Each one of these equations only took her about a minute on average.
Wow.
And so for her to, in about 10 minutes, plus or minus some, she was able to get 162 numbers and only made 7 errors and corrected them on the second time. And what was interesting is when she made those errors, they oftentimes might have been errors that have to do with more of a motor control issue. Because having talked with people who work with these children, they say that sometimes it's harder for them to that they'll accidentally hit it's kind of like when we hit the wrong key, and there's no reverse there for her to go, oh, I didn't mean that. But sometimes you would actually see we had a remote feed so that we could monitor the experiment from another room, and sometimes you could see that when she made an error, that she was a little frustrated because she couldn't. There was no way for her to express that as erase that. So the next time I do experiments, I'm actually going to have it built into her, whatever she's using as a communication device, something where she can communicate that she wants to backspace and correct something.
So an unbelievably amazing result. Statistically, I don't even want to get into statistics because it's just too outrageous, the kind of statistical significance there would be in that set of experiments there. 160 out of 170 or whatever it is, just too amazing to even calculate. What does this mean? What does it mean, Diane?
Well, I think that once telepathy is proven, and I really, one of the things I want to say is that because of the fact that there are these people who are such extreme skeptics out there, I'm not done yet. I presented this data at the Parapsychological Association's annual meeting in the Bay Area in August, and people who saw the video were just, they called it jaw-dropping. It really is. It's quite incredible footage, and the problem is that it's not blind the way that skeptics would like. The therapist who's there with her in the room is the one who knows the answer. Ideally, that wouldn't be the case. But when I listen to the whole story, if you really look at this and you try to be parsimonious with your conclusion, and you look at the fact that the father, the mother, two independent therapists, all of whom I interviewed independently for a half an hour or an hour each about this child, they would all have to be lying to me, because what they described to me is that she can do it without this particular setup. But there are skeptics who'll say, oh, there's an electronic device in the room. How do I know that it's not the electronic device? I mean, people are that skeptical. So what I need to do is I want to put the best foot forward. I want to go back and film her, and I have at least 2, if not 3 other children who are like her, to show that this isn't just this child. And armed with being able to show that it's not just unique to this child, and being able to go back and have the optimal setup, and that's going to put me in a position where I can write this up, and it will change everything, because you know how much hostility there has been towards this area of research. And when you actually come up with the first irrefutable data, and you have people who are neuroscientists who I really believe that I have an opportunity to get neuroscientists to agree with this data. I've shown it already to some of my, I've shown my paper, and I've also shown the experimental video to a psychiatrist from Johns Hopkins who looked at it and said it has to be telepathy. So I really have something powerful here. I want to present it to the world with the best platform possible. So I'm looking to raise money for funding this next wing to go back to India and a couple of other places in the world. And then there's also some children here in the U.S. and document their abilities, write it up, and change the paradigm.
Because you've been doing this, basically funding it out of your own pocket, more or less, up to now, right? I mean, this research generally costs a lot of money to conduct this on a full-scale basis if you were being sponsored by a university. I mean, this would be a $1 million plus kind of effort. And I'm sure you're just doing the best you can. But, I mean, you're having to fund this yourself, right?
Yes, and that's what slows down the progress. That's why it's been I haven't written another book since the ESP Enigma. It's not because I haven't advanced my model and my theory and thinking, and it's not that I don't have a lot more to say. It's that I have an active full-time psychiatry practice that pays my bills for me to go to India and for me to go and do these kinds of experiments.
How much money do you need to raise, Diane, and how can people hop on board? I'm definitely on board with this. Just give me the Kickstarter address and I'm in. But tell me how much we need to get and how we're going to do it and all that.
Well, what we're going to do is we're going to be starting a Kickstarter campaign on November 3rd. And the reason why we chose that date is because I'll be on Coast to Coast November 3rd, and there's a large audience then. And the Kickstarter campaign will be running through mid-December, and I'll be doing several radio appearances in the meantime. And so I want people to spread the news about it, tell your friends. And in terms of how much money do I need, if there's going to be different levels of funding because with Kickstarter campaigns, there's an art to requesting funding. I mean, ideally, $1 million would be phenomenal. That would enable me to devote myself to this work and get a book out there, get an article out there within this next year. If I got $100,000, that would enable me to go and my videographer and myself to go and actually get additional footage that we could then use for a documentary, and I could write up a paper. It wouldn't be enough money to create the documentary. So what I'm doing is I'm going to set an initial level of $100,000 just for me to go and do the next phase of this research, which I'm very optimistic will be all I'll need to do. I'm that close. But any money we raise beyond that will accelerate the pace at which this research gets out there.
Great. Well, we'll certainly do our part here at Skeptiko. Well, maybe a little bit before it hits on coast to coast, and we'll see if we can get a couple of folks over there to help get the ball rolling. It's important work. I just have serious doubts about whether or not this will lead to any big paradigm change, but I do think that you have some interesting angle in terms of, I think you understand what it takes, and tell folks a little bit about why you think this can really change some minds. I mean, it's not going to change everyone's minds, but tell us why you think this has a chance of kind of permeating that stone wall against anything like this, any kind of psi or parapsychology, paranormal phenomena.
Well, see, I think it's a combination of things. I think, first of all, it's the fact that I come from this neuroscience background and I'm a neuropsychiatrist and I can write about this and discuss it in scientific terms. Secondly, it's how compelling the data is. It's just strikingly compelling, particularly when you combine it with the stories of not only this child, but stories of other children who are highly telepathic. I have a model to explain it. You know, one of the things that I think that this is really actually an innate ability. I don't think it's supernatural. I think that it's an innate ability, but that autistic children are able to demonstrate it to the type of precision and reliability that is necessary for scientific proof. But I don't think it's a supernatural ability. I think it's something that is part of who we are as human beings, and it's innate in all of us.
I think that's looking through the wrong end of the telescope, but I'll go with you for purposes of getting it through. Sure, yeah.
Well, I think that what we call supernatural, see, one of the problems is that implies that it defies laws of nature. But when you think about the fact that we live in a world where Einstein radically changed our concept of time and space and matter, and that was a century ago.
But we don't really live in that world. I mean, that's the issue. We don't really live in that world. We just choose to say, well, that all sounds good. Let me just go on with things the way they are. But I don't know that we can live in that world. You know, I don't know that we're equipped to live in that world. And maybe what you're talking about is what I like. You know, last time you were on, I love the phrase that you put down. You said, I want to lay down a first paver for this, you know, like pave the highway. I want to just kind of put the first layer on the road, because we do have to start somewhere if we're going to try and turn the telescope around and say, hey, let's take a broader look at consciousness. So
right.
To that end,
but all I'm saying in terms of bringing in the physics, because say that, that's just using one weird phenomenon to describe another phenomenon, but right. What I'm saying is that it's because we actually do live in that world. It's not how we experience the world, because our brain is what plays a role in how we perceive our world. But we do live in that world. We do live in a world in which matter is made up of, it's not what we think it is. We do live in that world.
Right. And I wasn't trying to be too obtuse. I'm just saying in another way that we don't totally understand. We don't live in that world because we construct a world that says time is linear. Yesterday was yesterday, tomorrow is tomorrow. We
Right.
live in a world that we construct that says this
Right.
is solid. And then we encounter other people who don't live in that world. They say,
Exactly.
well, no, that's not really the way that it is. So
Yeah, exactly. But I also believe that it's like so for example with telepathy, I also believe though that it's like the 4-minute mile in the sense that people thought that you couldn't run a mile in less than 4 minutes and it was a psychological barrier.
right.
Once that psychological barrier was broken, it was broken, many more times and by at least 17 more seconds. And so I think that we have a very limited sense of what our potential is
Right.
the point that I'm getting at.
Yes.
And but in terms of being able to get scientists to look at this seriously, I realize from what I know as a neuroscientist that there are all of these phenomena that are already unexplained phenomena, and then when you lump them all together, it really challenges the way that people think about our brain and its relationship to consciousness. It really does. But you don't have to throw out neuroscience. There's a way of actually combining the best of both.
Right. There has to be. There has to be, because sometimes I get off on this thing about kind of knocking neuroscience and the kind of brain dead materialist reductionist, but it's super effective in a lot of areas, and we can't deny that. We have all these medical miracles that prove that, and all these drugs that prove that. So I think that's wonderful that you have that sense that they can be integrated. And I guess you're also saying I'm reading in what you're saying that you feel like there's a certain, groundswell of, if not support, maybe openness or willingness to kind of reconsider some of the ideas that you're talking about. Do you sense that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm seeing both. I'm seeing two things. One is that when I was at the Parapsychological Association meeting, I saw that people were much more optimistic about parapsychology and our research and the increased interest in it. People are much more optimistic about that. This is one of those pendulums that swings back and forth. But more importantly, there are more and more neuroscientists who are coming forward and saying, our model's broken, it doesn't work.
Right.
And in fact, there are over 400 neuroscientists who are protesting this brain mapping initiative because they see it as a waste of time. It's
Right.
not going to get us any closer to understanding. And so you have... So this is where I am a full member of both communities, and I understand each of them and what they know. But that's rare. Most people aren't in both communities and know what each other know. And I know what the parapsychological community knows, and there's a lot of really valid data out there that needs to be looked at. And I know what neuroscientists know, and that has to be incorporated into the model. If it's not, it'll get rejected. And I'm somebody who can do that.
That's very promising, and particularly the neuroscience that emerges out of the medical branch from these schools of medicine, some of the best schools of medicine in the world that you've been associated with, Johns Hopkins, Harvard, those kind of people. And the reason I say that is what I've seen in just observing this landscape is the medical people, they're just more pragmatic. They're like, hey, how do we get this done? How do we cure this illness? How do we make my patients better? And they're kind of less inhibited by the philosophical implications of things. Do you find that to be true?
Absolutely. That's one of the reasons why I want to present this to psychiatric communities, give it as a grand rounds, talk about it in terms of, initially talk about it from the standpoint of look at what we're seeing in this population of autistic children and get their interest. Because in psychiatry, people with autism aren't supposed to have a theory of mind. They're not supposed to realize that other people have ongoing thoughts. That's one of the that's one of kind of like the basic premises behind why it's named autism. Autism comes from autos, meaning self, and it's this. They think that they're antisocial and really don't have any concept of other beings as having consciousness, and that's far from the truth. And so the fact that this girl can be asked by a therapist, read my mind, and she actually gives an accurate representation, it's just like that alone breaks psychiatry's conception of these children, and it creates an opening to then say and look at this other thing as well. And yes, I do believe that clinicians, because those of us who actually work with these patients, we see that there's stuff that we don't understand. Neuroscientists are in the laboratories, and they're reading papers that confirm their theories, and they're not really having them challenged the way a clinician does. And there is a pragmatism of it's not about me, it's about service. And what do I need to understand to serve you? And I feel that way about individuals, and I feel that way about society.
Well, that's excellent. It's certainly an optimistic view of things, and there's nothing wrong with a little optimism now and then. So let's see if we can get everyone on board on this Kickstarter campaign. There aren't many research projects out there that have this much potential to really turn the ocean liner a little bit, but you certainly made a great case for yours, Diane. So again, that Kickstarter campaign, I will have that, folks, up in the show notes. I don't have it right now because Diane hasn't posted it, but I'll put it up in the show notes. Make sure you go over there and check it out and throw a few dollars that way and see if we can move this thing a little bit further along. Diane, it's been great having you on. Is there anything else we need to mention before we go?
Well, I was going to just put a little thing out there that was, I smiled when I read who won the Nobel Prize for Medicine this year, because it was work with rats, and it's work that's on their internal GPS system. And they've discovered these cells that are in the brain, that are in the part of the brain, that are in the region of the brain that's I'm very interested in, the limbic system, that respond to, that know where, it's a map of, that the mouse has, or the rat has, a map of their environment, and they trigger off certain cells specifically only when they are in that specific location within their environment. And that's what the Nobel Prize was given to, proving, that there is sort of a GPS in these brains. Well, there's also research that's very interesting about large cats who have territories, and they have a GPS in their brain in which they have a sense of their territory, and when there is another creature in their territory and not within sight or smell, they have similarly, they have a part of their brain that responds to that. And isn't that interesting? Because that goes along with this idea that we have within our brain an ability to navigate space-time around us. Do you see that?
Not exactly. The one thing that always kind of is hard for me is that when we start talking about neural correlates for consciousness, again, I can't help but feel we're looking through the wrong end of the telescope.
Oh, no, okay. Let me make sure that you understand this, because I think this is a very important part, because I'm not really looking through the wrong end of a telescope. No,
I know you're not. I just think I know you're not, and please explain it to me. I just worry that we have to put it in those terms in order for it to fit in with this, accepted paradigm that we have, that the brain is kind of creating consciousness kind of thing. But please go ahead.
No, it actually isn't about, this isn't about the brain creating consciousness. This is about the brain's ability to navigate our world in ways in which it's not the senses that we know about that the information's coming from. And so that goes against the model. that neuroscience has. This cat that is not, that this cat, the fact that a part of its brain lights up, or is active and starts and gives more of an electrical signal when specifically when something is happening within this internal map that it has of the world.
So there's an extra antenna in the rat's brain.
Right, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. And so the neurons, if there is perception, so if like when somebody perceives a vision, okay, and it could be that vision actually is associated with something that is, well, let's say just, any experience that you have, any human experience you have, whether it's hallucination or actually seeing something that is really there, they each light up the visual cortex. That doesn't explain anything. That's a correlation. Okay.
Right.
The reason why the correlation is important is not as an explanatory thing. The correlation is important because anything that is really happening in conscious experience has a correlate in neural activity, but the neural activity doesn't explain it. It just validates that this person is actually having an experience. So, for example, if you have two people in fMRIs that are in telepathic communication, and you have one person who's thinking about something that activates one specific part of their brain, and simultaneously the person in the other scanner has the same part of their brain activated, and you see that that's just something that shows you that there's something going on there, but it's not to be confused with mechanism.
I'm with you, Diane, and I don't want to get too far afield. I mean, just what pops into my mind is I don't even know that is valid. And you obviously know the research a lot better than I do, but I just stumble across these things. I stumble across, David Nutt's work in the UK with psilocybin. And there's an inverse correlation, right? I mean, we would expect these areas of the brain to be more stimulated, more excited, and they're not. They're less. Or the most dramatic case is near-death experience. Now we don't have any neural correlates at all, and we still have a conscious experience, as near as we can tell, that somehow gets reported back and gets incorporated in, maybe in some way gets reincorporated back into that physical structure of the brain. So I love what you're saying. And
what we do with the near-death experience, we do have neural correlates. Oftentimes, the neural correlate is a flatline EEG. So it's just that it's not the correlates that the current model would expect.
Right, but say, I mean, I think both. I'm with you on this. I mean, I think both are true. First of all, let me step back and I say that's fascinating new information for me. That the rat, we study it, and hey, it has another antenna here that isn't one of our five senses, but there it is, and it lights up like a GPS system when he walks into this familiar territory. That's really cool. And that the same thing happens in a cat. The cat has a GPS system. I mean, that starts explaining a lot of these strange phenomena. And I'm totally with you there. And there's huge advances that need to be made there. And I just think at the same time, we have this other stuff over here that will never fit into that, right? Because when we talk about the near-death experience and we don't have any electrical activity, and yet we have these, and we have this out of body. I mean, how could we even have senses that that just really freaks people out? And I don't know how those merge. And I think what's really exciting about what you're saying, and I totally with you on this, you say, we don't have to worry about some of those questions right now. We just have to kind of keep pushing forward. And like you're trying to push forward on this one front that is extremely promising. And you're saying, hey, let's lay down the path over here and come up over this next vista and see where that gets us, and then we can kind of tackle more and more of these questions.
Well, that's right. No, I'm not saying so. So what I'm saying, and I think this is really important, is that this research is not one that one could say that it's really addressing the issue of materialism. I think that it doesn't. This is addressing the conscious experience that people have when they experience something like telepathy or clairvoyance. This is not getting. There's still that question of how could something as immaterial as consciousness arise from the brain. That is a whole other area of research that I'm also engaged in, but that's a different question. You're right. And I'm not saying that this addresses that question. What I'm saying is that just like with the area of the brain, that if you stimulate it, if you stimulate the right temporal lobe, people will have a spiritual experience. Okay,
right.
And then you have
whatever that
scientists
means.
argue about, well, does that mean God exists? And some people say yes. Why would we have a place that gives us that experience if it didn't exist? And then you have other people say no, it's just an illusion. And so you're still going to have that kind of an argument after this work. There's still more years ahead to be continuing to do this research. I'm just trying to address this, as you said, just like I'm putting in the second paper.
Right. Great. And it sounds like a fantastic second paper. So we're going to try and get this out and see if our little audience can kick in. I never ask people to donate any money to the show, and I rarely ask them to support any causes, but I think this is the perfect kind of cause for Skeptiko listeners to get behind, because it's just real, it's science, it's research. How can you object to this? And it's very, very difficult to get this work done if it's not privately funded, because at this point, there's no one who's going to get behind this. Now, I imagine if you got a little bit further, you probably could get some institutions who could get behind it, but not at this stage, right?
That's correct. I'm optimistic that in the future that I'd be able to get traditional funding sources, but no, not at this time.
Well, Diane, this is great work again. Best of luck with it. And please do keep us in touch in terms of how it's going.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Take care.
Thanks again to Dr. Diane Powell for joining me today on Skeptiko. One question to tee up from this interview, and in keeping with this being kind of a throwback show on parapsychology, what do you make of this study? Do you see any flaws in it? Any potential holes in it? How would you tear it apart and then put it back together and give it a score? So please let me know your thoughts on that. Of course, the place to do it is through the Skeptiko website at Skeptiko. Don't forget the K. While you're there, be sure to check out all of our other shows, over 250 of them there. Subscribe to us on iTunes. Leave us a comment there on the site, or bounce on over to our forum and join the ongoing dialogue we usually have going on there. So that's going to do it for this episode. Have a couple of good ones coming up. Please stay with me for all of that. Until next time, take care, and bye for now.